Well, I'm no connoisseur of international independent films, but the film Force Majeure recently caught my attention. It's the story of a seemingly perfect family of four on a skiing holiday in the French Alps. There's the attractive parents in their 30s who are matching in smart casual wear, and they're outstanding citizens of their beautiful world. And the ski resort is slick, it's fitted with all the very best, and the hotel room is clean, line, neat luxury. And it looks out to perfectly snow-capped mountains. This is their designer world. And the purpose of this holiday is for Thomas, the father, who spends most of his time working, to spend more time with the kids. But on holidays, Thomas spends most of his time lost in his iPhone. And so in the first 10 minutes of the film, this is all the first 10 minutes of the film, the family are sitting together one morning having breakfast at this open-air restaurant when they look at a distant mountain and they see a controlled avalanche coming down the mountain. Well, Thomas gets out his iPhone to film it while the family start getting nervous. Are we safe here? And Thomas assures them that they'll be okay until it gets closer and closer, and his young son Harry screams as the avalanche is about to hit them. And just as all the diners in this open-air restaurant are hit with the snow, Thomas grabs his iPhone and he sprints away to duck for cover, leaving his family at the table. Now there's 30 seconds of virtual silence. And then gradually people pick themselves up, and you sort of see it through the whiteout scenes on the movie. And there's no damage, and everyone's okay. And it turns out that they were just covered by the residual snow shower. But some damage has been done, hasn't it? All of a sudden, their designer world has a crack in it. In some of the most excruciatingly awkward scenes I've ever watched, the two children ask their mum, "Where's Daddy?" And he soon appears from his hiding place, and without a word, everyone sits back at the table pretending that Dad hasn't really just run out on them. And so the rest of the film simply asks this: what sort of person is Thomas? What sort of person is Thomas? Well, last week we said that in the West, Christians are no longer the dominant influence on society. Our society is thoroughly post-Christian. In fact, the 2016 Oxford Dictionary Word of the Year was post-truth. Post-truth. And that means relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. The basic gist is that truth is now irrelevant. And so in the past 3 decades, we have seen culture move at a pace where things that were unthinkable a few decades ago gradually became radical, and then acceptable, and then sensible, and then popular, until our culture progresses to some new kind of normal that we're left to pick up the pieces of. And so the church once existed in relatively comfortable conditions in the West, but we've seen rapid cultural change. From being a majority to a minority. In 1911, the first census, 96% of people identified as Christian. A century later, it's half that amount, and the people between 18 and 34 are least likely to identify as Christian. We've moved from majority to minority. Secondly, we've moved from insider to outsider. The church is no longer looked to in crisis. And thirdly, we've moved from respected to disrespected. There's a new morality, and we are its rebels. And so this has come through an avalanche of individualism and self-deification, where the highest virtue is now you and your happiness. And that seems to be about the wisest thing that our culture can come up with: you and your happiness. But like the perfect family in Force Majeure, is everything about this message as beautiful as it seems? There's a crack emerging in the wisdom of this designer world. And as we saw last week, Mark Sayers writes this. He says, "We find ourselves in the midst of a beautiful apocalypse where everything falls apart while looking beautiful. While people are working hardest on their Instagram exterior, there are cracks on the inside showing more addiction than ever, more depression than ever, more anxiety than ever. And we saw that at the same time as this is happening, often the church has responded to this decline by trying to be relevant to culture. Let's be relevant. Let's try and connect with the culture. And what we found is that hasn't worked, because what it's done in a lot of cases is ripped the guts out of Christianity just when Christians needed resilience. They needed to work out how to be resilient in this post-Christian designer world. And so we said that the church has to become a creative minority. And what that means is a loyal community, people who are stubbornly loyal, who stay together tightly, and who don't seek to be relevant but resilient, who are saturated with upholding God's glory and walking the Calvary road of sacrifice. It's a posture toward an ungodly culture that says, I stand against you, and yet I also stand with you. And I also stand for you. It's not an angry posture toward culture, but one that stands up and gets down in the mud where real people are hurting. Now, this is really significant for us. If you're just yelling at culture, if you're just angry, if you're just mourning the loss of your cultural influence, Christendom, what Christendom produced, where it enabled you to be a Christian with relative ease, if all you're doing is yelling at culture and you're not down in the mud where people actually need you, then you really have no voice. You really have no footing with which to speak to the culture. And so as a Christian in this particular moment, what does this mean for us practically? Well, this text this morning, it helps us with this avalanche of post-Christian, beautiful designer world culture by saying, what sort of person is Daniel? What sort of person is Daniel? How does he face this avalanche? And so we're going to look at that, and at the same time I want to keep on introducing you to the book of Daniel. We're still kind of in introduction mode, and so I want to kind of keep orientating you to its content and structure. And one of those key contextual things to know about the book of Daniel is to understand the nation of Babylon, and what its driving ambition is. And so verse 1, just have a look there, tells us that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. So Babylon is very key to this story. And who is Babylon? Well, Babylon is basically the largest of the time, is the largest city of the known world. It's modern-day Iraq. And it was a place of lofty ambition. In fact, this is a quote from National Geographic. Babylonian citizens saw their city as a paradise, the center of the world and symbol of cosmic harmony that had come into existence when its supreme divinity, the god Marduk, defeated the forces of chaos. The spread of the cult of Marduk across Mesopotamia was proof of Babylon's prestige. No ancient city was so desired and feared, so admired and denigrated. And so Babylon was a superpower. In fact, in the 19th and the 20th centuries, there was a German archaeologist, Robert Koldewey, who unearthed the Ishtar Gate. This is a sparkling gate that Nebuchadnezzar built because Nebuchadnezzar was known for his construction, building a beautiful, big, magnificent city that spoke to his glory. And so you have the Ishtar Gate that is now actually been rebuilt and on display in Berlin. You also have the ziggurat, which was basically the ancient world's first skyscrapers. And so Babylon was a powerful nation. And so what is the driving ambition of Babylon? Well, we can trace that back to the very beginning of the Bible in Genesis 11, and a very familiar statement. Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let's make a name for ourselves. Now, of course, this would be familiar to you because this was the Tower of Babel, a moment that birthed the ambition of Babylon. And it always has been from that point, its driving ambition has been to create a utopian city without God. A utopian city without God. You see, Babylon was far more than just an ancient Near East nation. In the Bible, Babylon is actually used as an archetype. It's used as a kind of model for a world system that runs all the way from the beginning through to the end, where there's 3 chapters dedicated in Revelation to the city of Babylon versus the city of the New Jerusalem. A city without God versus a city of God, and of course we know how that ends for both. And so the structure of Daniel points to this very thing. Just bear with me about the structure, but it's quite significant in showing us this message. The book of Daniel basically has two halves, from chapter 1 to chapter 5, and then chapter 6 to chapter 12. And you see that there's a pairing that happens in both halves. So you have a court scene in chapter 1, which we've just seen today, and then you have two images in chapter 2 and 3. One's a dream image, where Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and the other is a gold image. And then in chapter 4 and 5, you have two kings disciplined. So you have one that's restored, Nebuchadnezzar, and then you have one that is destroyed, and that's Belteshazzar. And so in the first half of the book, you have a court scene followed by two pairs, two images and two kings. Well then, at the end of chapter 5, at the end of the first half, you have the end of Babylon as an ancient Near Eastern nation, because Belteshazzar is killed. And Darius comes in, and actually the Medo-Persians come in and they occupy the land that was known as Babylon. And so in the book of Daniel, there's different rulers that come in and take place. Now, of course, Daniel outlasts them all. And so this is the first half. It ends with the end of the ancient Near Eastern city of Babylon. And the second half opens with the kingdom transitioned to Medo-Persia. And in chapter 6, we're back in a court scene. So we're back in the court, it's the Medo-Persian court, and it's followed by two pairs. Two visions, so you have two visions of beasts in chapter 7 and chapter 8, and then you have two writings, one in chapter 9, and then a literary unit in chapters 10 to 12. And in this second set of writings, it announces the eventual destruction of the world system that rivals God and his everlasting righteousness. And so in both halves, you have a court scene followed by two pairs. And so even the structure of Daniel tells us that there's a tale of two cities, and there always has been. One which is seeking to build a utopia without him, and the other which is seeking, which has him at the middle of the city, and through which all culture will one day perfectly flow. And that is the city of the New Jerusalem. And so really the big question of the Bible is this: which city do you belong to? Do you belong to the city of Babylon, or do you belong to the city of the New Jerusalem? And so who is Babylon? Well, it is an ancient Near Eastern city, but also we are right in the midst of Babylon. We are right in the midst of this world system that is trying to create a utopian city without God. This is the driving ambition of Babylon. And so now what you even have, to bring this into relevance into our day, is that you have many church leaders saying that the gospel is essentially about enabling personal freedoms, where the narrow gate of Jesus is now open much wider than it always was, and looks a lot more like universalism, where in the end love wins and everyone enters the New Jerusalem, no matter what you ever believed, no matter what you ever did. And so this is kind of the new gospel. It's allowing personal freedoms. And if you don't allow those personal freedoms, or even if your beliefs don't connect with those personal freedoms, then you are the new immorality. And so let me just plead and beg with you for one moment, that is a lie. That is a lie. That is not the message of the Bible. It's a message that comes from people who don't really read it, who do not love God's word, and who in fact are, even in the name of Jesus, trying to create a universal designer world, but without him. But without him at the center. That is Babylon. That is our cultural moment. Now, why is this happening? Why is this happening? Well, I wonder if you can see what's happening in the text between verses 3 and 7. We looked at the driving ambition of Babylon. Now we see the deceptive agenda of Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar knew that to overcome God by simple military force wasn't enough. He had to make them thoroughly Babylonian. And so he took the cream of the crop to wash them of their Jewishness. And this is how he did it. The first step was isolation. And so verse 3, you see that the king isolates them from influences that would actually mold their lives and characters in the way of God. And so they were separated from worship, they were separated from the Hebrew scriptures, they were away from the wisdom of the people of God. And by doing this, Nebuchadnezzar thought that the last dying embers of their faithfulness would be snuffed out. And so he actually isolates them from their people, and he brings them into the kingdom. into the palace. Secondly, indoctrination. In verse 4, the boys are enrolled at the Babylon University and they're taught the language and the literature of the Chaldeans. And this actually reflects a current time that we're living in that makes education the number one priority. It's absolute nonsense to believe in revelation, reason. Everything should be reasoned. The highest virtue of education is now to basically teach people to be open-minded. Open up your mind. Don't close your mind off to anything. And so this is the highest virtue of education, and this is the indoctrination of our culture. And then thirdly, you have indulgence. To make Daniel Babylonian, the finest of the king's palace was put out before him to appeal to their appetites and their ambitions. Give in to your desire, be true to yourself. And so Babylon holds out this vision of what the good life is. And the biggest pull of our culture is the easy life where there's always plenty and that nothing is too difficult. And then fourthly, and this is really the big one, is identity. In verse 6, you see that they're renamed. Now, in the ancient Near East, your name was way more than a label. It was your identity and even your destiny. And so a personal name was thought to indicate something essential about the bearer, about who they were, their identity, their origin. And so Daniel, we know that the name Daniel means Yahweh is my judge. This was the name that was given to him, the Hebrew name that was given to him. Yahweh is my judge. It speaks to his identity, what he believed, his origin, his destiny, that Yahweh was his number one to live for. And Nebuchadnezzar renamed him to mean, his name to mean, may Bel protect his life. May the Babylonian God protect his life. Hananiah means the Lord shows grace. And Shadrach, which is the name he was changed to, means under the command of Aku. Mishael, who is what God is, was changed to Meshach, who is what Aku is. Azariah, the Lord helps. Abednego means the servant of Aku. And so this was a repressive change. This was to completely undo who they were, to change their identity. And identity is the big theme of our time. Who are you? Who are you really? Can I be the way I feel? And the deceptive agenda of Babylon is changing the meaning of words. It's changing the meaning of names and who people are. And so you see these words changing in our society. Think of the word tolerance. Think of the word, how the meaning of the word tolerance is changing. It used to mean that you could tolerate a person who held an opinion that you didn't like, and you could still be around them and you could still tolerate them. But now it means that if your beliefs impede the freedoms of others, then you don't have the right to hold it. This is the new definition of tolerance. Think about the word family. Think about the word marriage. This is the clever confusion and the deceptive agenda of Babylon, which is luring people in to change the definition of names. And what we're facing in our time is what it actually means to be human. What is a man? What is a woman? And all of this points to the number one theme of our time, identity. The buzzword of our time is actually fluidity, where nothing is fixed, everything is fluid, and that is supposed to actually be something that's appealing to us, to be fluid, to have no fixed authority, to have no fixed definition. And this is the deceptive agenda of Babylon. Now, do we stand a chance? Do we stand a chance against this? Did the boys stand a chance? Well, you can imagine that they were feeling under pretty intense pressure. And I wonder, as you face this culture, whether you feel this sense of intense pressure to change your definitions, to change the things that you've always believed, to change where your fixed authority is. Well, perhaps they were under so much pressure that they were wondering where God was in all this. But what we see in chapter 1, verse 21, it's kind of a quite compelling statement or summary statement in verse 21 that says that Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. Now that's a telling statement because it means that Daniel lived in exile for the full period of time. He lasted the distance in exile. And you see, I believe what Daniel was holding on to here was the promises of God. Even the very fact that they were in exile proved to Daniel that God keeps his promises. Even though that was an awful thing to endure, this is exactly what God said would happen to people who were unfaithful. And so Daniel actually has claimed the promises of God and knows that even if they're in exile, that this was the Lord's hand. And so Babylon was to be the scene of Daniel's lifelong service. The place where he would demonstrate what it means to sing the Lord's song in a foreign land, which is what it says in Psalm 137, verse 4. He knew that in a foreign land, he was in a foreign land because of the hand of the Lord. It's like the statement of Paul in Philippians 1:12. I want you to know, brothers, that the things that have happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel. So these things that are happening in our culture, these things that have happened to me, have turned out for good, for the good of the gospel. And I believe that this can be true in our particular cultural moment. This could be the door for the gospel to flourish on one condition. And that's what really this message is all about, on one condition. It's your stance and your attitude toward Babylon. It all boils down to your attitude and your stance toward Babylon. And here it is in verse 8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. This is the key to this whole text. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. He resolved. Daniel made up his mind. That statement means he purposed in his heart. You see, in this designer world of Daniel, he was a person of no compromise. Last week we said that there were two undesirable postures toward this post-Christian culture. One is separatism, where you separate yourself fully from the world, and the other is syncretism, or being sucked in to this world. And my question for us today is, has Babylon taken a foothold in your heart and life? The power of modern-day Babylon is not a hard power. It's a soft power. This is a quote from Mark Sayers. It says, the soft power is lubricated by technology and the promise of consumerism. Through the mythologies of advertising, media, the internet, and the instructive example of celebrity, a vast mental world is daily constructed in our minds, painting the possibility of a godless utopia, a secular heaven on earth in which an individual life is infused with pleasure, peace, and possibility achievable this side of death. You see, soft power is not like a monster wave that you see. It's the subtle rip that is under the ocean. You're swimming between the red flags and then all of a sudden you look up and you can't see your stuff anymore and you've drifted a mile down the beach. It's not a monster wave coming on the horizon. It's a subtle rip that destroys people. You know, our culture kind of sends us messages like this. It's like, you've had 3, take another. Watch Game of Thrones. There's nothing pornographic about that stuff. You like it. Have it. You deserve it. You can't afford it. Don't worry about it. Put it on credit. You're on the couch late at night with your girlfriend. Of course, that's fine. You love her. You haven't done it for ages and you're sweet just this one time. You only look at these harmless pictures. You're only human. This is the soft power of our culture. And it has cumulative effects on a person that take you somewhere and you wake up one day and you never thought you'd be there. The deceptive agenda of Babylon is to isolate you from Christian community, make you busy, make you stressed, make you overworked, make you blissfully unaware of your need to saturate yourself in Sunday worship and daily devotion. But you can stand by drawing a line, by purposing in your heart. The deceptive agenda of Babylon is to indoctrinate you by feeding you worldly ideas through reality television and themes in movies that make you feel like your life is boring and unsatisfying, and to laugh at people's misfortune and critique what they're wearing, and to believe that your education has more cognitive value than your spiritual life. But you can stand by drawing a line, by purposing in your heart that you're not going to live that way. The agenda is to indulge you, to constantly feed on your desire for luxury and comfort and escapism, and to make you selfish with your money and possessions, to spend it on yourself, but you can stand by drawing a line. It's to confuse who you really are, making how you feel your highest concern and your driving force. So I want to stop here and ask you, what sort of person are you becoming in this designer world? As the avalanche of post-Christian culture comes, are you just confronting it with your iPhone in hand, with your mind on your next exciting thing, with your holiday, your things, your status, your image, your happiness, your personal freedoms? Has the deceptive agenda of Babylon just softly drawing you in? But he did not defile himself. Why? Because he'd purposed in his heart not to. I want to tell you this morning that the difference between standing for Christ in this designer world and being sucked into it is whether or not you've made up your mind. Have you made up your mind? And this issue is that if we're going to stand in society, character is crucial. It is not a mere question of intellectual competence, but of character. So, West men, I don't want to hunt or be suspicious of you, but what's going on in your life behind closed doors? What are you looking at? What's your imagination being captured by? What's in your search history? What places are you going that lure you in? What does your budget say about what you love? And West women, what are you dreaming about, longing for, watching and reading that's setting up you to be worldly in your thinking and expectations? I wonder if there's something that pops into your life, your heart right now. Little areas of compromise. You might sort of be wondering, wow, Andy's going back to the 80s where they talked about movies and not sleeping with your girlfriend in church. And I want to tell you something about that. Many of us are really, really worried. We're really hurting, perhaps even angry about what's going on in our compromised world. And I wonder today whether God is asking you to actually look inside your heart and whether you are compromising. Whether you are compromising what God really wants. And so for some time now, I've been trying to become a more disciplined man in many areas, from bedtime to social media to work habits to spending time with God. And about 3 weeks ago on my day off, I'm just lounging around, doing nothing, watching a Netflix series. And it wasn't anything R-rated at all, but the themes and the premise and the gist of the show was altogether worldly, feeding me things that aren't helpful for a man. And I just realized as I watched it, and then the whole evening afterward, that there was this distance between me and the Holy Spirit. And I was trading the experience of His presence by filling up my mind with stuff. And I just got sick of it. Nothing is worth knowing that presence of God. And so this sermon ain't about movies. It's about compromises that bring a sense of distance between you and God, which models just where our culture is heading. And I just really believe that if you want to wake up in the morning and not have to feel like your relationship with God is just an abstract idea, like if you want to actually wake up in the morning and feel like this is actually a personal relationship with a real God, then you have to become a person of no compromise. And so in this whole business of compromise, what I am learning is that it involves learning to live in two places at once. Fully present in the moment, not seeking escapism, and fully aware of the presence of God. It's there that you start to kind of change. It's there that you're not willing to trade anything for the presence of God, not seeking to escape or hate the moment you're in, but be fully present in the moment you're in, whatever you're doing, and yet be fully aware of the presence of God. I want to ask you, does anything come to mind for you this morning? I want to finish with something practical because Jesus is very practical. He says, repent. And that's not an overly super spiritual idea at all. It just means turn and change. And I want to give you some real practical things about turning and changing. Firstly, is motivation. Do you want to change? Do you want to change? The thing that you're holding on to, the piece of Babylon that's in your heart that you won't let go, do you want to change? Why? Is it just about feeling better about yourself, or is it because God is glorious and He's gracious and He sent His Son for you to die on the cross for you? Change, is about what you love. You sin because you love it more than God, and your motivation must be a new affection for God, cultivating love and desire for Him. Secondly, you need vision. Proverbs 29 says that where there's no vision, the people perish. You need a vision for life as it should be, life as it could be, life as Jesus described it, life as Jesus lived. You need a vision for that and to see the joy of that. And thirdly, you need intention. This is what Daniel did. Based on the grace of God and the promises of God, he made inward resolutions. He made inward resolutions. He made some decisions. And this is what we need to do. We need to make some decisions, and we need to share those decisions with people that you trust. Now, a lot of times in the change process, that's where it stops. Intention. I intended to do it. And so lastly, you need means. You need concrete, calculated steps in the right direction. If you have an addiction to social media, do something about it. Get one of those old brick phones. If something is getting between you and God, if you're not experiencing the presence of the Holy Spirit and you know there's just that distance because you're just filling up your mind with rubbish and trading the presence of God for the things of this world, then take concrete steps, because nothing is worth trading. I want to live fully in each moment. I don't want to live escaping each moment. I want to live fully present in each moment, and I want to be fully aware of the presence of God. And so what sort of person are you becoming in exile? Are you being drawn in by Babylon? What sort of God is God? And we see as soon as Daniel makes this decision that God's favor, Daniel attracts the favor of God, and he's given favor in the sight of the eunuch. And what we see in the rest of the book, which we're going to keep looking at, is because Daniel was faithful in the small thing, God entrusted him with much. And this is true for all of us. Many of us, we have these imaginations. I could do these amazing things for God, and we dream about how we could live for Christ this very particular way, and we imagine all the great things that we could do for God, and what the Lord is looking for us to do is to be faithful in the small thing, to not compromise, to be a person of no compromise. That's what's going to stand the test in this culture. And so this morning, just for a moment, would we not look out in this world and get angry at this world and wonder why it's going the way it's going, and actually just look in our own heart and saying, am I compromising? Am I compromising the glory of God? And if that's you in your heart, then turn and change and make some changes and come before the Lord and ask him for forgiveness. And the grace of God is such that it comes. See, it says in the word that he resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. If you lower yourself, if you come before him, if you seek his grace and his goodness, he comes to that. He moves to that. He brings his favor to that.